The snow fell in heavy sheets across the open Wyoming plains, blinding in its intensity as Josephine Coleman stumbled forward, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping the remnants of a tattered shawl that offered little protection against the brutal December storm of 1874. Blood trickled down her legs, freezing almost instantly against her skin as the contractions grew closer together. She'd been walking for hours since her husband had thrown her from their wagon, declaring he wouldn't raise another man's bastard child. "Please," she whispered, her lips blue and cracked, "just a little further." But further to where? The nearest town was 15 miles away, and night was falling fast. Her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to her knees in the snow. The baby kicked violently inside her, as if protesting their dire circumstances. As darkness descended and the temperature plummeted further, Josephine caught sight of a faint orange glow in the distance. A fire. Hope surged through her frozen body as she forced herself back to her feet, stumbling toward the promise of warmth, of life. The pain hit her again, more intense than before, doubling her over. She let out a cry that was swept away by the howling wind. When she looked up, she realized the light was closer than she'd thought, a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping, partially sheltered from the worst of the storm. With the last of her strength, she dragged herself to the cabin door and pounded her fist against the rough-hewn wood. "Help!" she managed, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. "Please help!" The door swung open, revealing a tall man with a rifle in hand and suspicion in his eyes. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth from a roaring fire. "Good God," he muttered, his rifle immediately lowering as he took in her condition. "Get in here, woman, before you freeze to death." Josephine couldn't move, her strength finally abandoning her as her legs gave way beneath her. The man dropped his rifle and lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. As consciousness began to slip away, she felt herself being lifted into strong arms and carried into blessed warmth. "My baby," she whispered. "Please save my baby." "You're safe now," the man said, his voice gentler than she would have expected from his rugged appearance. He quickly wrapped her in thick fur blankets and laid her near the fire. "This is home. You're both safe now." When Josephine awoke, the cabin was quiet save for the crackling of the fire. She was lying on a small bed, covered in furs that smelled of pine and smoke. Her body ached, but she was warm gloriously, blessedly warm. Her hands immediately went to her belly, panic rising when she felt the flatness there. "Your daughter is fine," came a deep voice from across the room. Josephine turned her head to see the bearded man sitting in a wooden chair, cradling a tiny bundle in his arms. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion. "My daughter? How long have I been unconscious?" The man rose and approached, carefully transferring the swaddled infant into her trembling arms. 2 days. The birth was difficult, but you're both fighters." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his severe features. "I'm Vincent Keller. Most folks call me Vince." Josephine gazed down at her daughter's face, perfect and peaceful in sleep. "I'm Josephine Coleman. Joe, usually." She looked back up at him, tears filling her eyes. "You delivered her?" Vince nodded once, moving back to tend the fire. "Not my first. Spent some time with the Shoshone years back. Their medicine woman taught me a few things." He poked at the logs, sending sparks up the chimney. "You were lucky. Another hour out there, and neither of you would have made it." "My husband," she began, then stopped, unsure how to explain. "Figured that part out," Vince said, his back still to her. "No man lets his pregnant wife wander in a blizzard unless he's dead, or worse than dead." He turned, fixing her with a penetrating gaze. "He coming after you?" Josephine looked down at her daughter, tracing a finger over the perfect bow of her tiny lips. "No, he's not the father. He made that very clear when he discovered the truth." She swallowed hard. "He said he wouldn't raise another man's bastard." Vince cursed under his breath. "Some men don't deserve the title." He returned to his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. Come spring, I can take you to Laramie, or wherever you're heading." Josephine felt a tear slide down her cheek. "I have nowhere to go. My parents disowned me when I married Arthur, and now—" She left the rest unsaid. Vince was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. Finally, he said, "This cabin ain't much. It's too small and drafty in winter, too hot in summer. But there's food enough for 3, and no one to trouble us this far out." His eyes met hers. "You and the little one can stay as long as you need." The baby stirred in Josephine's arms, making small, mewling sounds. Without a word, Vince stood and brought her a cup of water and some dried meat. "Eat. You'll need your strength to feed her." As Josephine ate, she studied her unlikely savior. He moved with the efficient grace of a man accustomed to self-reliance, his hands calloused but surprisingly gentle when they brushed against hers. There was a wariness about him that spoke of hard lessons learned, yet he had taken in 2 strangers without hesitation. "Why are you helping us?" she asked finally. Vince paused in his work of preparing a thin stew over the fire. "Out here, you don't turn away someone in need. Storm like that would have killed you both." He shrugged, as if saving their lives was a simple matter of practicality rather than kindness. "Does she have a name?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. Josephine looked down at her daughter, considering. "Hope," she decided. "Her name is Hope." The corners of Vince's mouth turned up slightly. Fitting. That night, as snow continued to fall outside the cabin walls, Josephine lay awake listening to her daughter's soft breathing and the occasional creaking of floorboards as Vince moved about, adding wood to the fire. She had never felt so vulnerable, yet strangely secure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were warm and safe, and that was miracle enough. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by Hope's needs and the harsh winter weather. Vince proved to be a skilled hunter, bringing back rabbits and occasionally deer to supplement their diet of dried foods. He showed Josephine how to cure the meat and tan the hides, wasting nothing. "Been trapping in these parts for 5 years now," he explained one evening as he worked a piece of leather into a tiny pair of moccasins for Hope. "Sell the furs in Laramie come spring, buy what supplies I can't make or hunt." "Alone all that time?" Josephine asked, rocking Hope by the fire. Vince's hands stilled momentarily. "Wasn't always alone, had a partner for a while. Good man." His jaw tightened. "Fever took him 3 winters back." Josephine heard the unspoken grief in his voice. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy, without inviting further conversation on the subject. Yet as the evening wore on, he surprised her by speaking again. "Had a wife once, too, before the war." He kept his eyes on his work, but his voice had softened. "Sarah, yellow fever in '62 while I was fighting with the Union. Came home to an empty house and a fresh grave." Josephine felt her heart constrict. The war changed everything for so many. "That it did." Vince set aside the finished moccasins and stretched his shoulders. "What about you? Where were you headed before your husband decided to become the worst kind of coward?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't spoken of her past since arriving at the cabin, and Vince hadn't pressed. "West," she said finally. "Just west. Arthur had grand plans about striking it rich in the gold fields of California." "And the baby's father?" Josephine stiffened, instinctively holding Hope closer. "A mistake," she said quietly. "Or so I thought at the time." Vince studied her face for a moment, then nodded as if she'd confirmed something. "Well, the little one doesn't look like a mistake to me." He stood, moving to check the rabbit stew simmering over the fire. "She's got your eyes." The simple observation, delivered without judgment, loosened something in Josephine's chest. "She does?" "Doesn't she?" she murmured, looking down at Hope's sleeping face. "I pray that's all she inherits from me." "What's that supposed to mean?" Vince asked, frowning as he stirred the pot. Josephine sighed, suddenly weary. "Poor judgment, willfulness, tendency to believe pretty lies." She stroked Hope's downy head. "I want better for her." Vince returned to his seat, fixing her with his direct gaze. "Seems to me it takes courage to leave a bad situation, especially in your condition. Willfulness can be a virtue when it's about survival." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Don't sell yourself short, Joe. That little girl is lucky to have a mother brave enough to face a blizzard to give her a chance at life." His words brought tears to her eyes. For months, all she'd heard were condemnations from Arthur, from herself. Vince's simple faith in her strength was like water on parched ground. "Thank you," she whispered. As January gave way to February, the worst of the winter storms passed, but the snow remained deep around the cabin. Vince continued his hunting trips, never gone for more than a day at a time. He fashioned a cradle for Hope from a hollowed log, lined with the softest rabbit furs, and built a small lean-to off the main cabin to smoke meat. Josephine, regaining her strength, insisted on contributing. She took over the cooking and mending, and on clear days helped Vince check his trap lines. They rarely spoke of the future, existing in a strange, peaceful present that seemed removed from the rest of the world. One evening, as a gentle snow fell outside, Vince returned from hunting with a small pine tree slung over his shoulder. "What's this?" Josephine asked, looking up from where she was nursing Hope by the fire. "Thought the place could use some brightening up." He set the tree in a corner and produced a small cloth bundle from his pocket. Unwrapping it, he revealed a collection of carved wooden figures: a bear, an eagle, a wolf, and several other animals. "They're beautiful," Josephine said, genuinely impressed by the detail. "Did you make these?" Vince nodded, a hint of embarrassment coloring his features. "Something to pass the time on long winter nights. Thought maybe Hope might like them when she's older." The gesture touched Josephine deeply. This gruff, solitary man had opened not just his home, but his heart to them. She watched as he carefully arranged the figures around the base of the small tree, creating a miniature forest scene. "You're good with your hands," she observed. He glanced up with a rare smile. "Had a lot of practice. Used to carve toys for my brother's children before—" He trailed off, and Josephine knew he was thinking of the war again. "Do you ever see them? Your brother's family?" Vince shook his head. "John died at Gettysburg. His wife took the children back east to her family." He straightened, brushing pine needles from his hands. "Better that way, probably. I wasn't fit company for anyone after Sarah died." "And now?" Josephine asked softly. His eyes met hers, holding a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Now, I'm starting to remember what it's like to have a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." That night, after Hope was settled in her cradle and Vince had gone outside to check on his horses, Josephine stood before the small mirror nailed to the cabin wall. The woman who stared back was both familiar and strange thinner, with new lines of worry etched around her eyes, but also stronger somehow. Her hands moved to her hair, attempting to bring some order to the golden-brown waves that had grown wild during her confinement. The door opened, bringing in a rush of cold air as Vince returned. He paused when he saw her standing before the mirror, an odd expression crossing his face. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He shook his head, removing his heavy coat. "No, just... you look different tonight." Self-conscious suddenly, Josephine turned away from the mirror. "I'm trying to look less like something dragged in by a mountain lion." To her surprise, Vince laughed a rich, genuine sound she'd never heard from him before. "You've never looked like that, Joe. Not even half frozen and in labor." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Now you're just being kind." "I'm many things, but kind isn't a word most would use for me." He moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach. "I'm not good with pretty words, but you should know you're beautiful, always have been, from the first moment I saw you." Josephine's breath caught. She'd seen the way his eyes sometimes followed her, when he thought she wasn't looking, but she'd attributed it to natural curiosity or perhaps concern. Now, standing in the intimate warmth of the cabin with the snow falling gently outside, she recognized the look in his eyes for what it was. "Vince," she began, uncertain what to say. He held up a hand, stepping back. "You don't need to say anything. I know your life's complicated enough without an old trapper making it more so." He turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire. "Just wanted you to know, is all." Josephine stood frozen, a tumult of emotions washing through her. Arthur's betrayal was still a raw wound, and she'd sworn never to trust a man again. Yet Vince had shown her nothing but respect and kindness, asking nothing in return. He'd saved her life, delivered her child, given them shelter and protection without a second thought. Before she could find the words to respond, Hope began to cry, breaking the tension in the room. Josephine hurried to the cradle, lifting her daughter and cradling her close. When she looked up again, Vince had moved to the door, pulling his coat back on. "Going to check the traps once more before full dark," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Won't be long." After he left, Josephine sat by the fire with Hope, troubled by the new awareness between them. Part of her wanted to retreat, to protect herself from further hurt. But another part, a part she'd thought had died, when Arthur cast her out, responded to the quiet strength and integrity Vince radiated. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered to Hope. "Is your mama being a fool again?" Hope gazed up at her with unfocused eyes. One tiny hand escaped from her swaddling to grasp at Josephine's finger with surprising strength. When Vince returned an hour later, they ate their evening meal in companionable silence, the awkwardness of their earlier exchange seemingly forgotten. But later, as Josephine lay in the bed Vince had insisted she take while he slept on a pallet near the fire, she found herself watching him through half-closed eyes, wondering what life had in store for them when spring finally came. March arrived with warmer days and the first signs of thaw. Patches of brown earth began to appear amid the snow, and the creek near the cabin ran swift with meltwater. Hope grew stronger daily, her tiny features becoming more defined, as her newborn fragility gave way to the robust health of an infant well-loved and cared for. Vince began preparations for his annual trip to Laramie, checking and bundling his furs, making lists of supplies they would need for the coming year. He spoke of we and us without seeming to notice, while Josephine found herself increasingly torn about the future. She had no claim on him or his home, yet the thought of leaving filled her with dread. In the little cabin, she and Hope had found safety and peace. And Vince had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. One sunny afternoon, as Hope napped and Vince worked outside repairing a damaged trap, Josephine made a decision. Setting aside the shirt she'd been mending, she stepped outside to find him. He was seated on a stump, his back to her, working a piece of metal with focused attention. The spring sun glinted off his dark hair, now tied back with a leather thong. He'd trimmed his beard recently at her suggestion, revealing a strong jawline and unexpectedly sensual mouth. "Vince," she called softly. He turned, shading his eyes against the sun. "Everything all right?" She nodded, moving closer. "I wanted to talk to you about spring and what happens next." A shadow crossed his face, but he set aside his work and gestured for her to sit on a nearby log. "Been thinking about that myself." Josephine gathered her courage. "You've done so much for us already, more than I could ever repay. But I need to ask one more thing of you." He waited, his expression guarded. "When you go to Laramie, I'd like to go with you." She rushed on before he could speak. "Not to stay there. I want to return here, with you, if that's what you want too." Vince stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a difficult text. "You want to stay? Here?" "Yes." She met his gaze steadily. "This place has become home to me, to Hope, and you—" She faltered, suddenly uncertain. He stood, pacing a few steps away before turning back to her. "Joe, you should know what you're asking. Life out here is hard, especially for a woman. Winters are brutal. The nearest neighbors are 20 miles away. There's no church, no school, no—" "I know all that," she interrupted. "I've lived it these past months. In the worst of winter, yes. But there's more to life than survival, Joe. You deserve better than this." He gestured around at the rough cabin and surrounding wilderness. "Hope deserves better." Josephine felt a flare of anger. "Don't tell me what my daughter deserves. She deserves to be loved and safe. She deserves a home with people who care for her." She stood, facing him directly. "She has that here, with you." Vince's expression softened. "Joe, unless I've misunderstood," she continued, her voice wavering slightly. "If you want us to leave, just say so plainly." "God, no!" He stepped closer, his hands rising as if to touch her before falling back to his sides. "Having you here, both of you, it's been like finding something I thought was lost forever. But I don't want you staying out of gratitude or because you think you have no other choice." Understanding dawned on Josephine. "You think I'm settling for you because I'm desperate." He didn't deny it, his silence confirmation enough. Vincent Keller, for a smart man, You can be remarkably obtuse." She closed the distance between them, looking up into his weathered face. "I'm not settling. I'm choosing. I'm choosing the man who saved my life and delivered my child. The man who treats a woman with respect and doesn't judge her for her past mistakes. The man who carved toys for a baby that isn't even his." She took a deep breath. "I'm choosing you, if you'll have me." For a heartbeat, he remained motionless. Then his hands came up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness. "I never dared hope," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "After Sarah, I thought that part of me was dead. And after Arthur, I thought I'd never trust again," she whispered. "We were both wrong." When his lips met hers, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. His hands trembled against her skin, and she realized that this strong, capable man was as vulnerable in this moment as she was. The knowledge gave her courage to deepen the kiss, her arms winding around his neck as he slid around her waist, drawing her closer. The sound of Hope's cries from inside the cabin eventually separated them. Vince rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I should let you," he began. Josephine nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "We'll continue this conversation later." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it completely. "Count on it." That evening, after Hope had been fed and settled for the night, they sat together by the fire, closer than they had ever allowed themselves before. Vince's arm rested comfortably around Josephine's shoulders, her head against his chest, where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, "about Hope's father." Vince's arm tightened slightly around her. "You don't owe me any explanations, Joe." "I know. But I want you to understand." She sat up, turning to face him. "Before I married Arthur, I was in love with someone else, James Harrington. He was kind and gentle, everything Arthur wasn't. But he was poor, and my parents disapproved." She looked down at her hands. "They arranged my marriage to Arthur, who had money and prospects. I was young and afraid to defy them." Vince remained silent, listening intently. "The night before my wedding, James came to me. He begged me to run away with him." Her voice faltered. "I was too afraid, but we said our goodbyes." She glanced up, meeting Vince's eyes. 9 months later, Hope was born. Arthur knew immediately she wasn't his. The timing was impossible. "What happened to James?" Vince asked softly. "He left town after my wedding. Last I heard, he joined a cattle drive heading to Texas." She sighed. "He never knew about Hope." Vince considered this for a moment. "Do you regret it? Not going with him?" Josephine thought carefully before answering. "I regret marrying Arthur. I regret not having the courage to choose my own path sooner." She reached for Vince's hand. "But I can't regret anything that led me to this moment, with you." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "We can't change the past, Joe, but the future? That's ours to shape." The trip to Laramie in early April marked Josephine's first venture beyond the immediate surroundings of the cabin since her arrival. Vince had crafted a small cart that could be pulled behind his sturdy mare, creating a comfortable nest of furs for Hope and space for their trading goods. Josephine rode the other horse, a gentle gelding that Vince assured her was steady as a rock. The journey took 3 days, with stops along the way to camp for the night. Vince was ever vigilant, his rifle always within reach, but they encountered no trouble beyond a brief spring shower that left them damp but unharmed. Laramie itself was a shock to Josephine's senses after months of isolation. The bustling streets, crowded buildings, and constant noise seemed overwhelming. She found herself staying close to Vince as they made their way to the trading post where he conducted his annual business. The proprietor, a balding man named Simmons, greeted Vince warmly before his eyes widened at the sight of Josephine and Hope. "Well now, Keller, looks like you've been busy this winter," he said with a knowing grin. Vince's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Coleman and her daughter will be staying with me. We need supplies for 3 now." If Simmons noted the different surnames, he made no comment. He was, however, more than happy to direct Josephine to the dry goods section, where she could select fabric, thread, and other necessities while Vince negotiated the fur sales. As she browsed the shelves, hope secured against her chest in a sling Vince had fashioned from soft deer hide, Josephine became aware of curious glances from other shoppers. A well-dressed woman approached, her smile tight with barely concealed disapproval. "You must be new to town," the woman said, eyeing Josephine's simple dress and the baby. "I'm Mrs. Thornton, the Reverend's wife." "Josephine Coleman," she replied, nodding politely. "Just passing through, actually." Mrs. Thornton's gaze flicked to where Vince stood at the counter, then back to Josephine. "Traveling alone with a child is most unusual, Mrs. Coleman, and in the company of—" She left the implication hanging. Josephine felt her face flush with anger, but before she could respond, Vince appeared at her side, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. "Found everything you need, Joe?" he asked, his voice deliberately casual, though his eyes were hard as he regarded Mrs. Thornton. "Nearly," Josephine replied, leaning slightly into his touch. Mrs. Thornton was just introducing herself. The woman's lips pursed as she looked between them. "Mr. Keller," she said stiffly, "I trust you'll be staying in town long enough to attend services on Sunday? The Reverend has been most concerned about your spiritual welfare these past years." Vince's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's mighty thoughtful of him, madam, but we'll be heading back to our home tomorrow." Long journey with a little one. The emphasis he placed on the word "our" was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Thornton's expression soured further, but she merely nodded and moved away, clearly eager to share her observations with others. "Sorry about that," Vince murmured once she was out of earshot. "Small-town gossip is worse than any blizzard." Josephine squeezed his arm gratefully. "I've faced worse than nosy church ladies." That evening, they took a room at the modest hotel on the main street, a luxury Vince insisted upon, rather than camping another night with the baby. After a proper meal in the hotel dining room, they retired early, Vince gallantly offering to sleep on the floor, beside the bed, where Josephine and Hope would rest. As she nursed Hope in the lamplight, Josephine watched Vince prepare his makeshift bed. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "The bed is large enough for both of us." He paused, looking up at her with a question in his eyes. "I trust you, Vince," she continued. "Completely." He nodded slowly, though he finished arranging his bedroll nonetheless. "It's not about trust, Joe. It's about respect. I meant what I said to that woman today. You and Hope are my family now. But we haven't made any formal commitments to each other." Josephine regarded him thoughtfully. "Is that important to you? Formality?" "Not for myself." He sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "But for you and Hope, yes. You deserve to be properly wed, not just living with a rough trapper in the wilderness." She set Hope down in the center of the bed, now sleeping peacefully after her meal, and moved closer to Vince. "Then ask me," she said, her heart pounding. His expression changed, wonder and hope warring with uncertainty. "Here? Now? Where better? We're in a proper town, with a church just down the street." She took his calloused hand in both of hers. "Unless you're having second thoughts?" Vince shook his head emphatically. "Never that." He slid from the bed to one knee beside it, still holding her hand. "Josephine Coleman, I've loved you since the moment you fell into my arms half frozen in that blizzard. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times, yes. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Josephine found herself standing before the sleepy-eyed Reverend Thornton in the small white church at the edge of town. She wore her best dress, the only one she'd brought, that wasn't designed for practical wilderness living, and held Hope in her arms. Vince stood tall beside her, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt she'd never seen before. Mrs. Thornton was conspicuously absent, though the Reverend himself seemed content enough to perform the ceremony for a generous donation to the church roof fund. 2 strangers from the hotel served as witnesses, their names already fading from Josephine's memory as she repeated her vows in a clear, steady voice. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend intoned finally. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Keller." Vince's kiss was gentle and brief, mindful of their audience and the baby between them, but his eyes held promises that sent warmth spreading through Josephine's body. "Mrs. Keller," he whispered against her lips, the name sounding right in a way nothing had in a very long time. They left Laramie within the hour, their wagon loaded with supplies for the coming year: flour, sugar, coffee, new tools, fabric, seeds for a garden, even a few books and toys for Hope as she grew. Josephine wore a simple gold band on her finger, matching the one Vince now wore, a luxury he had insisted upon despite the cost. As the town receded behind them, Josephine felt a lightness in her heart that had nothing to do with the bright spring sunshine. She was heading home, truly home, with her daughter and the man who had saved them both. The return journey seemed shorter somehow, filled with quiet conversation and shared smiles. They spoke of practical matters, expanding the cabin, preparing a garden, building proper furniture, but also of deeper things: hopes, dreams, the kind of life they wanted for Hope. "I want her to be educated," Vince said one evening as they camped beside a clear stream. "Better than I was. My ma taught me letters and figures before she died, but after that," he shrugged, "learned most of what I know from experience and a few books." Josephine leaned against him, watching Hope sleep peacefully nearby. "We'll teach her together, and perhaps when she's older, if she wants more learning than we can provide." "We'll find a way," Vince promised, "whatever she needs." On the third day of their journey, they crested the final rise that overlooked the valley, where their cabin nestled against the mountainside. Josephine caught her breath at the sight. The small structure that had seemed so humble now looked like a palace to her eyes, surrounded by greening meadows and sheltered by towering pines. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller," Vince said, his arm around her waist as they paused to take in the view. "It's beautiful," she whispered, meaning far more than just the scenery. That night, after they had unpacked the wagon and settled Hope in her cradle, Josephine and Vince stood before each other in the privacy of their cabin, husband and wife in truth now, rather than just in name. The firelight cast a golden glow over Vince's features as he reached for her, his touch reverent. "I never thought I'd have this again," he murmured, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "A family. A purpose." Josephine leaned into his touch. "Nor I. After Arthur, I thought my life was over." She smiled up at him. Instead, it was just beginning. When he kissed her, it was with a passion that had been carefully banked until this moment. His hands tangled in her hair as hers explored the broad expanse of his shoulders, learning the shape of him as he learned hers. They moved together toward the bed that was now theirs to share. Husband and wife, creating their own private world of touch and taste and whispered endearments. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the fur blankets, Josephine's head pillowed on Vince's chest. She felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, feeling the dampness against his skin. "I'm just happy," she whispered, "truly, completely happy." His arms tightened around her. "That's all I want, Joe. To make you and Hope happy for as long as I live." She raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, memorizing the beloved lines of his face in the dying firelight. "You already have." Spring gave way to summer, and the small homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Vince expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a covered porch where Josephine could sit with Hope on warm afternoons. A vegetable garden took root beside the cabin, providing fresh food to supplement their diet of game and preserved stores. Hope grew rapidly, her sunny nature bringing joy to their daily lives. She learned to roll over, then sit up, each milestone celebrated with pride by both Josephine and Vince. Though he was not her blood father, Vince doted on Hope as if she were his own, carving new toys as she outgrew the old ones and singing old trail songs to soothe her to sleep. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Josephine took Vince's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I think Hope will have a brother or sister come spring," she said softly. Vince's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "You're certain?" She nodded, smiling at his obvious joy. "As certain as I can be. The signs are all there." He gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I never thought, after Sarah, I'd given up hope of having children of my own." "Are you happy then?" she asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, pulling back to look into her eyes. "Grateful, blessed, terrified. He laughed, the sound full of emotion. All of those at once. Josephine leaned into his embrace, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I feel the same way, but mostly grateful. For you, for this place, for the storm that brought me to your door. Vince's hand moved in gentle circles over her still flat stomach. We'll need to be prepared this time. No midnight blizzard deliveries. No, she agreed, thinking of her harrowing journey through the snow. Though I couldn't have asked for a better midwife than you. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. Let's hope this little one arrives in more favorable circumstances. As autumn painted the surrounding forests in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine and Vince prepared for the coming winter and the new life growing within her. They smoked meat, preserved the bounty from their garden, and gathered wild berries and nuts from the surrounding woods. Vince hunted deer and elk, ensuring they would have plenty of meat to see them through until spring. On a crisp October morning, as frost silvered the meadow grass, Josephine sat at the small table Vince had crafted, writing in a journal he had brought her from Laramie. Hope played at her feet with wooden blocks, occasionally pulling herself up on her mother's skirts to stand on wobbly legs. The door opened, admitting Vince along with a gust of cold air. He stomped snow from his boots, his arms laden with firewood. "Storm's coming," he announced, setting down his burden beside the hearth. "Sky's got that look." Josephine closed her journal, marking her place with a ribbon. Will it be a bad one? Hard to say this early in the season. He removed his heavy coat and hung it by the door before crossing to kiss her upturned face. But we're ready for it, whatever comes. She smiled, catching his hand before he could move away. I was just writing about the night we met. 1 year ago, next month. Vince's expression softened as he crouched beside her chair. Best night of my life, though I didn't know it at the time. You saved us, she said simply. In every way a person can be saved. He shook his head, his hand moving to rest on her rounded belly. You saved me too, Joe. I was existing, not living, just one day after another, with no purpose but survival. His other hand reached for Hope, who grabbed his finger with a delighted gurgle. You and this little one gave me a reason to live again. That evening, as the predicted storm howled around their snug cabin, Josephine sat by the fire mending one of Vince's shirts while he carved a small wooden horse to add to Hope's growing collection of animals. The baby slept peacefully in her cradle, untroubled by the wind that rattled the windows and sent occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Reminds me of the night you came, Vince said, glancing up from his carving. Though that storm was worse. Josephine nodded, remembering the desperate cold, the pain, the fear. I thought we would die out there. I had given up hope. And yet you kept walking, he observed. That's courage, Joe. She set aside her mending, one hand resting on her stomach where their child grew. I had something to live for then. Now I have even more. Vince put down his knife and the half-finished horse, moving to sit beside her on the hearth. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. Been saving it for the anniversary, but seems fitting to give it to you now, with the storm reminding us how we began. He withdrew a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft leather. When Josephine unwrapped it, she found a beautifully carved pendant on a leather cord, a mother bear with 2 cubs nestled against her. Vince, she breathed, running her finger over the intricate details. It's exquisite. The Shoshone believe the bear represents strength and motherhood, he explained, helping her fasten it around her neck. Seemed right for you. Josephine blinked back tears, touching the pendant where it rested against her collarbone. I'll treasure it always. Later that night, as they lay together listening to the storm, Vince's hand protectively covering the swell of her belly, Josephine thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened girl forced into a loveless marriage, to a desperate woman cast out in a blizzard, to this, a beloved wife and mother, safe and warm, in the arms of a man who had proven his worth not with pretty words, but with unwavering devotion. What are you thinking about? Vince murmured against her hair, his voice drowsy. About how things work out sometimes, she replied. How the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, if we're brave enough to keep going. He pulled her closer, his body warm and solid against hers. "Wisest thing I've ever heard," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now sleep, Mrs. Keller. Our family needs you rested." As the winter deepened, the small family settled into a comfortable routine. Vince ventured out to check his trap lines when weather permitted, always returning before dark with game for their table and stories of what he'd seen in the silent, snow-covered forest. Josephine kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively, teaching Hope her first words and preparing for the baby's arrival. Christmas was a simple but joyous affair. Vince cut a small pine tree just as he had the previous year, but this time, Hope was old enough to delight in the wooden ornaments he carved and the colored ribbons Josephine had saved from their wedding trip. They exchanged modest gifts: a new knife for Vince, a set of hair combs for Josephine, and a soft stuffed rabbit for Hope made from scraps of fur. "Next Christmas there will be 4 of us," Vince observed as they sat before the fire, Hope sleeping contentedly in his lap after the excitement of the day. Josephine smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I can hardly believe it sometimes, that this is my life now." "Having second thoughts?" he asked, only half joking. She leaned over to kiss him gently. "Not for a single moment. This is everything I never knew I wanted." January brought the heaviest snows they had yet experienced, effectively isolating them from the outside world. Vince's careful preparations ensured they had ample supplies, and the expanded cabin provided enough space that they didn't feel confined, despite being unable to venture out for days at a time. One stormy afternoon, as Josephine sat teaching Hope to string wooden beads on a leather thong, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the edge of the table. Vince was at her side instantly, alarm clear on his face. "Joe, what is it?" "Just a twinge," she assured him, though uncertainty colored her voice. "It's too early yet." He frowned, helping her to a chair. "You're sure? With Hope coming early?" "That was different. I'd been walking for hours in a blizzard after—" She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the memory of Arthur's cruelty. "This is just my body preparing, I think. The baby isn't due for at least 6 more weeks." Vince didn't look convinced, but he nodded, keeping a watchful eye on her for the rest of the day. When no further pains came, they both relaxed, though Vince insisted she rest more than usual in the days that followed. February arrived with a brief thaw that allowed Vince to venture further afield, checking traps that had been inaccessible during the worst of the winter. He returned one afternoon with a deer slung across his horse's back and unexpected news. "Met a trapper from the north," he told Josephine as he hung his coat by the door. "Says there's a doctor settled in at Fort Crawford, just 3 days' ride from here." Josephine looked up from where she was helping Hope build a tower of blocks. "A proper doctor, all the way out here?" Vince nodded, crossing to warm his hands by the fire. "Army surgeon who decided to stay on after his service ended. Treats settlers and Indians alike. According to Jenkins, that's the trapper." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm thinking we should go there when your time comes. Be safer for you and the baby." Josephine considered this. The idea of having medical assistance was appealing, especially after Hope's difficult birth. But leaving their home so close to her time? What if the weather turns, or the baby comes early? "We'll go before there's any chance of that," Vince assured her. "Mid-March, when the trails are clear enough. Set up in town for a few weeks until the baby arrives." He crossed to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I delivered Hope because there was no choice, Joe. But if there's a safer option for you this time, I want to take it." His concern touched her deeply. "All right," she agreed. "If the weather holds and I'm feeling strong enough, we'll go." The decision made, they began preparations for the journey. Vince constructed a more comfortable wagon bed, lining it with the softest furs they had. Josephine sewed new clothes for Hope and prepared a layette for the baby, using fabric she'd been saving since their trip to Laramie. As March approached, however, nature had other plans. A series of late winter storms swept down from the north, bringing heavy snow and temperatures cold enough to freeze the creek solid. Travel became impossible, and Josephine knew they would not be making the journey to Fort Crawford after all. "Don't worry," Vince assured her one evening as they lay in bed, his hand making soothing circles on her swollen belly. "We did fine with Hope, and we'll do fine with this one too." Josephine covered his hand with hers, feeling the baby kick against their joined palms. I know we will. Between the two of us, this child doesn't stand a chance of arriving unprepared for. He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. That's my brave Joe, always finding the bright side. The first signs of labor came on a clear, cold night in late March. Josephine woke to a familiar tightening across her abdomen, different from the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She lay still for a moment, counting the time until the next one came 15 minutes. Still early, but definitely the beginning. She turned to Vince, who slept peacefully beside her, his face relaxed in a way it rarely was during waking hours, loath to disturb him yet. She eased herself from the bed and moved quietly to the main room of the cabin, stoking the fire and putting water on to boil. Hope slept in her small bed in the corner, having graduated from her cradle some months before. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Josephine felt another contraction, stronger than the last. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing through it as Vince had taught her during Hope's birth. Joe? Vince's voice came from the bedroom doorway, rough with sleep but quickly sharpening with awareness. Is it time? She nodded, managing a smile as the pain eased. I think so. But it's early yet. The pains are still far apart. He was fully alert now, moving with purpose to gather the supplies they'd prepared. Clean cloths, a sharp knife he'd sterilized in the fire, strips of leather for tying the cord, the herbal mixture he'd learned from the Shoshone woman for easing pain and preventing bleeding. How long have you been up? He asked, frowning as he noted the fire already built up and water heating. Not long, she assured him. I wanted to let you sleep while you could. He shook his head, coming to gather her gently in his arms. Always thinking of others, even now. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. This time, let me take care of everything. You focus on bringing our child into the world. The labor progressed steadily throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Vince kept Hope occupied with games and stories, explaining in simple terms that her mother was working hard to bring her new brother or sister. The little girl seemed to understand, bringing her favorite wooden horse to Josephine to help with the working. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Josephine's contractions intensified, coming closer together and lasting longer. Vince settled Hope with her dinner, then returned to Josephine's side. His presence a steady anchor as the pain washed over her in increasingly powerful waves. You're doing beautifully, he encouraged, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. Just like with Hope, strong and brave. Josephine gripped his hand, drawing strength from his unwavering confidence. Tell me again about when you first saw me, she gasped as another contraction ebbed. At the cabin door. It had become something of a ritual between them, this retelling of their beginning. Vince smiled, continuing to bathe her face and neck as he spoke. I was sitting by the fire, cleaning my rifle, when I heard the knock. So faint I thought at first it was just the wind, but something made me check. His voice was low and soothing, a counterpoint to the intensity of her pain. There you stood, like an apparition in the snow, your face so pale I thought you might be a spirit. Then I saw your eyes so determined, even at the edge of collapse. Josephine closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her as another contraction built. And then you fell right into my arms, like you were always meant to be there. You looked up at me and said, "My baby." And in that moment, I knew I'd do anything to keep you both safe. His hand squeezed hers gently. I wrapped you in furs by the fire and told you, "This is home." I didn't know then how true those words would become. The contraction peaked, stealing Josephine's breath. When it passed, she managed a smile. Best thing that ever happened to me, falling into your arms. As twilight deepened into night, the time between contractions shortened until there was barely a pause for Josephine to catch her breath. Vince had settled Hope to sleep and now knelt beside the bed, supporting Josephine as she moved into the final stage of labor. I can see the head, he told her, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. One more big push. Joe, just like with Hope. Gathering her remaining strength, Josephine bore down, a cry escaping her lips as she felt the baby slide into the world and into Vince's waiting hands. A boy, he announced, his voice breaking. "We have a son, Joe." The baby's lusty cry filled the cabin as Vince quickly cleaned his airways and wrapped him in a soft blanket. He placed the infant on Josephine's chest, where the newborn immediately quieted, blinking up at his mother with unfocused eyes. "Hello, little one," Josephine whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted his fingers and toes. "Welcome home." Vince sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Josephine's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's downy head. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion, just like his mother. After completing the necessary post-birth tasks with the same competence he'd shown during Hope's delivery, Vince brought a cup of broth for Josephine and settled beside her on the bed, watching in wonder as their son nursed for the first time. "What shall we call him?" Josephine asked, her exhaustion evident, but her eyes bright with joy. Vince considered for a moment. "What about James?" he suggested softly. "After his grandfather." Josephine looked up in surprise. Vince had never shown any jealousy or resentment toward Hope's biological father, but this gesture of acknowledgement touched her deeply. "James Vincent Keller," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Vince leaned down to kiss her gently. "Thank you for our son, Joe. For our family." "Thank you for giving us a home," she replied, her free hand reaching up to touch his face. "In every sense of the word." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Keller family. Hope grew into a lively, curious girl, with her mother's golden brown hair and a spirit as wild and free as the mountains surrounding their home. James, sturdy and serious like his namesake father, shadowed Vince's every move from the moment he could walk, eager to learn the skills of hunting, trapping, and woodcraft. Two more children joined their family: Elizabeth, born on a summer morning in 1877, and Michael, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm in 1879. Each birth was easier than the last, with Vince's confidence growing alongside Josephine's experience. The cabin expanded with their family, eventually becoming a proper house with multiple rooms, glass windows ordered from Denver, and a stone fireplace that Vince built with rocks hauled from the creek bed. A barn housed their growing collection of livestock: horses, a milk cow, chickens that scratched in the yard, and even a pair of goats that Hope had begged for on her 8th birthday. As civilization pushed further west, they found themselves less isolated. A small settlement grew near Fort Crawford, providing access to supplies, a school for the children as they grew older, and occasional social gatherings that Josephine enjoyed more than she would have expected of her former solitary self. Vince's trapping business evolved into a more diverse operation. He still sold furs, but also guided hunting parties from the east, sold horses he bred and trained himself, and even tried his hand at mining when a small vein of silver was discovered on their property. The extra income allowed them comforts they had once considered luxuries: books for the children, a proper piano for Josephine, who had played as a girl, and education funds set aside for each child's future. Through it all, the bond between Josephine and Vince deepened and strengthened. The passion of their early days matured into a partnership of equals, each complementing the other's strengths and shoring up weaknesses. They faced hardships together: drought years, a fire that nearly claimed the barn, illnesses that swept through the family one harsh winter, and celebrated triumphs both large and small. On a golden autumn evening in 1886, 12 years after a desperate young woman had stumbled through a blizzard seeking shelter, Josephine stood on the porch of their home, watching Vince teach James and Michael how to string a bow in the traditional Shoshone style. Hope sat nearby, sketching the scene in a book Vince had brought her from Denver, while Elizabeth braided wildflowers into chains beside her. The sight of her family healthy, happy, secure, filled Josephine with a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. From tragedy had come this blessing, from desperation, this abundance. Vince looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. After all these years, a single look from him could still quicken her pulse. He said something to the boys and crossed to join her on the porch, his arm sliding naturally around her waist. "Happy?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Josephine leaned into his embrace, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder, as it always had. "Beyond measure," she replied. Do you ever think about that night when I first came here?" He nodded, his cheek resting against her hair. "Every day. How could I not?" It was the beginning of everything. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his beloved face, now lined with the passing years, but no less handsome to her eyes. "I've never properly thanked you, for saving us that night." Vince shook his head, his hands warm at her waist. "No thanks needed, Joe. You gave me far more than I gave you." He glanced at their children, then back to her face. "A life worth living, a love worth fighting for." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband, her rescuer, her partner, her home. "I love you, Vincent Keller," she whispered against his lips. "Today and always." His arms tightened around her, holding her close as darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the evening sky. "And I love you, Josephine Keller, beyond all measure, beyond all time." From the yard came the sound of children's laughter, a reminder of all they had built together from that desperate beginning. The cabin that had once seemed so small now stood as the heart of a thriving homestead, a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to heal wounds, to create a future brighter than either could have imagined on that snowy night so long ago. This was home, not just the buildings and land, but the love they had found in each other's arms, a love born in the midst of a blizzard, tempered through hardship, and now flourishing in the warmth of a family created against all odds. A love that had begun with a desperate knock on a cabin door and would continue, Josephine knew with absolute certainty, long after they were gone, living on in their children and their children's children, an endless legacy of the night a cowboy had wrapped a pregnant woman in furs and said those simple, life-changing words, "This is home.